Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm your host, Liz Lang. Each week on this podcast, we will break down various aspects of mental health. We are so excited you're here and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Jeremiah and Selina Woodruff from Core Connection. And this week we are going to begin our book review on The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And this is a book I highly recommend that all parents read because there's a lot of really important information. And I will warn you, it's research dense. He goes into a lot of research and he discusses a lot of research, but it's important. But before we dive into all that, I have this week's parenting moment, which technically isn't even my parenting moment. It's my parents' parenting moment, but it serves twofold purposes. One, it's something that I've always appreciated the way my parents handled. And two, it highlights a core concept that we're going to get into today, and that is the underdeveloped frontal cortex of the teenage mind. So this happened either my junior or senior year of high school. So I was right around 17 or 18. And I had to leave for school early one morning or some school event early in the morning before the sun was even up. And my mom at the time was driving a small midnight blue hatchback. So you can guess where this is going. I put the car in reverse and heard the crunch of bumper on bumper. And in my panic, I didn't put the car in park before I jumped out of the car to assess the damage. So I run back, and in my haste and in my panic, and this just shows you how irrational teenagers sometimes think, I'm literally trying to push the van, a white minivan, off of my mom's car before I finally had the presence of mind to think, okay, I should probably jump back in the car, drive forward a few inches, and then put it in park. So teenagers do not think clearly in those types of high stress situations, okay? And that is a direct result of that frontal cortex, which is the decision-making part of your brain. It doesn't fully develop until around your mid-20s. And I obviously was really embarrassed and I was kind of scared to tell my parents, but I did. I went in there and I told them, hey, and I had to wake them up and say, hey, I just backed into mom's car. And they were clearly not happy, but I've always appreciated that they didn't yell at me or they didn't say anything like, how could you do this? How could you do something so stupid? They just said, okay, and kind of moved on, and that was kind of the end of it. And it could have been they were also maybe beating themselves up a little bit for parking right behind me when they knew I had to leave early in the morning. Not that excuses my behavior, because even though I was a teenager, I'm still ultimately responsible when I get behind the wheel of a car, right? But there could have been some of that going on. But I've always appreciated that in the moment, the way they handled it, that they didn't yell and get mad or frustrated. And I don't blame them for being unhappy about it. Like it's not just something, oh, good job. Way to learn a lesson here.
Nicely done.
Yeah. But I did appreciate that they didn't just blow up at me in the moment. So that is a core part of what we're talking about today, is this underdeveloped frontal part of the brain. And this also is responsible for reward seeking. And it is responsible for helping teens and young adults delay of gratification, resist temptation, and it's even essential for self-control. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we see it all the time, right? Mm-hmm. We've raised teenage kids, and it's definitely an interesting thing to see their capacity to use logic or manage emotions and manage themselves on a daily basis. We've had those kinds of experiences as parents as well, and it is incredibly frustrating sometimes, and yet it is just the process that all of us go through as our brains develop, as we develop, as we gain the capacity to have insight and understanding, and then to use logic and reasoning to make good, healthy, sound decisions.
I think it's helpful to know that information, because then you're able to deal with situations like that I don't know, easier. I was going to use the word easier, but I don't know if it's easier. But it
Yeah,
helps you to realize. It helps you to realize where it's coming from and why things are happening, and why your child is experiencing what they are when you know how their brain is developing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that, information is power, right? Knowledge is power is a common thing that we hear, and it's absolutely applicable in situations like mine as a 17-year-old who you would think should be responsible or is considered responsible enough to drive a car and hopped out before I even put it in park in a panic. That's totally classic, just, dumb teenager move of just not thinking properly, not thinking things through. So this is kind of how Jonathan Haidt starts his book, is that the brain does not fully develop even after the body fully develops. And the body reaches full maturation, and it varies for girls and boys. But after they reach full body maturation, their brain is again still developing. And so another thing that he talks about and kind of what he opens the book up is he starts with Gen Z, which is the first generation in history to go through puberty with smartphones. And he also gives some stats. And I'm just going to briefly go through these stats because they're not the main point, but they're important to understand kind of the premise of what he's setting out for this book here. So he talks about major depression among teens increasing by 150% for both boys and girls since the age of 2010. And then college anxiety has increased 134% since 2010, and depression 106% has increased. So that's anxiety and depression among college students. And then the last one that he cites, or another important stat that he cites, is according to a Pew Research study, in 2012, only 23% of teens had smartphones. And by 2016, 79% of them had smartphones. And so he goes through a lot of information about tying the increase in anxiety and depression to the use of social media in particular. Is his main focus is social media, but he also talks about smartphones and why smartphones can be so detrimental to developing minds. And a lot of people tried to say, well, of course Gen Z is depressed. They had to go through the 2008 global financial crisis. School shootings are at an all-time scary record high, and American politics is absolutely insane and so divisive. But the problem with that is that these same trends that we're seeing in the US are translating into other countries, where other countries such as Canada, Australia, and the UK, who weren't hit as hard by the 2008 financial crisis, they don't have the school shootings that we do, and their politics aren't as divisive. They're still struggling. Their teens are still struggling as much as our teens are. So the only link is the fact that this massive shift in technology, and the first iPhone was released in 2007. And so smartphones have adapted and evolved to try to hold your attention as much as possible. So they went from kind of being this convenient tool to how can we keep users engaged for longer to make more money? And that's really detrimental. So that was a lot of information. What are your guys' kind of thoughts on just kind of what's been going on, and your thoughts on, well, giving your 12-year-old or 11-year-old unfiltered access to the internet and a smartphone?
I think it was interesting to hear some of this data and see some of the things of where it's come from and the research that's been done and where that all lies, to understand how technology and social media is affecting our children. What I thought was really interesting is also realizing over the years from this data that was shared in this book, over the years, how we've become way more protective of our children. Mm-hmm. We're way more aware of strangers and sex traffickers, and those kind of things have become more scary to us. And so we start to protect our children physically. In that sense, we don't let them go outside by themselves and play. But we're being more careful what we feed our children, right? And making sure that they are eating healthy, good food. But on the flip of that, we're giving them access to things on the internet that are not safe for them. So having those same protections for our children, to be aware of where there's dangers in those things too, and to be equally protecting them from things that are on the internet.
Well, and I think he makes the point in the book that the internet is where a lot of the worst dangers exist and the highest risks exist for our children today. That's where sexual predators are. That's where a lot of these individuals who would seek to do harm are. And make no mistake about it, Facebook and Instagram and Reddit and TikTok and all these major social media platforms, they have no interest in protecting your children. They have interest in keeping their minds focused on being on the screen. And the longer we keep them on there, the more money we make. And it's such a great revenue source for them. And I'm not in any way saying that some of those things can't be used for good, because they can. They most certainly can. But it is so destructive for children. And to give them, uncontrolled access becomes risky at best and detrimental to the well-being of our youth today. And I think that that's what the anxious generation does, is kind of lays out the whys and the hows of that. It's a great book for parents to read, to understand before they start making the decisions about what kind of access to give their children. I think it would be wise to have this information in the back of your mind before those decisions are made.
And one of the points that he makes really well is this idea that when you give a kid a smartphone before puberty, it hinders the ability of adults to effectively guide or mentor them. Because what's happening when you give a kid a smartphone, they suddenly have access to all of the information at their fingertips. They can download apps, whatever. Like if you just say, here's the smartphone, do whatever you want. And even if you don't allow them to purchase things, right, they can download any app or game they want. They can spend hours scrolling on social media. Adults have all probably fallen into that pit of what's called doom scrolling at some point or another. They can just Google endlessly. And so kids also seek dopamine. And so when you give kids access to that, when you give them the ability to that, they're going to be consumed because it triggers the reward center in their brain, and they want to keep doing it more because they say, oh, this feels good. And so when you don't put any guidelines or restrictions on them, then they're not going to pay attention to you. That phone is way more engaging than mom or dad is. And it's not any fault of the parents that the parents aren't just more entertaining or or lack the ability to connect with their kids. They just can't compete with a smartphone or with a technological device. And the same can be true with tablets as well. And, tablets are kind of common and prevalent, especially in school, right? Most kids come home from school with some sort of Chromebook, iPad, or some sort of tablet that they can use for school. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But again, you run into the same problem. A parent or an adult and even friends are going to find it really hard to compete with a technological device.
Yeah, that's that dopamine hit that just kind of goes crazy for all of us when we have access to those kinds of things. And I think I want to exercise a little bit of caution here. There are lots of opportunities to have your children engage in technology devices in healthy and appropriate ways, because they are part of our world. And so we need them. Our children need to know how to use them. And there's great information that's accessed through them. And there's also ways that I know the book really plays hard at, never allowing kids under this age or that age to do this or that. And while I agree with about 98% of it, there are also options where we can hand a kid a smartphone that's completely locked down, that doesn't have internet access, that doesn't have access to app stores. And there's always the risk of kids getting around it. But I'm going to tell you right now, if they're going to get around those rules, they're getting around the not having a phone too. And they're going to have access to those things in some way, shape, or form. we've had friends who've had kids buy their own like burner phones and get access to things. Like if they're going to do it, they're going to do it. But here's an opportunity as parents to teach and to educate children on healthy use and setting limitations and using some of the devices that have been developed to kind of protect them can be super helpful in kind of guiding the process as you go through this with your children, to give them access to the technology for the good and to hold back on the areas that maybe aren't so good for them.
And I would completely agree with that sentiment that technology is so deeply embedded in every aspect of our lives. And that really is a good thing. Technological advances have brought us so far. I mean, you think of the advances in medicine and all of the amazing things that we can do to improve the quality of people's lives through medicine. That's technology. A lot of that is largely due to technological advances. And so it is a really key and important component of the world we live in. And so, yes, teach your children how to safely interact with the world, with their entire environment, but there's still a lot that you can do to shield them. So one thing that I want to jump back to real quick is something that Jonathan Haidt focuses on in part 2 of his story, is this transition from what he calls a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And so basically back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, kids would just go outside all day and play. And parents would just send them out. And even for me, the rule was you had to be home by the time the street lights came on. That was the rule growing up. Other than that, you could just go I could just go hang out in my neighborhood. And my parents were not really concerned about what I was doing. And that's changed and that's shifted because, again, we've become so afraid of sexual predators and crime and drunk drivers and all of this. And so he gives an interesting stat that those things are actually way less prevalent than they were in the 80s or 90s. And so kids are in less danger. Now, just because there are in less danger does not mean that there is zero risk. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell parents that they should just let their kids go out and wander because the world isn't as scary as a place as they believe it to be, because things do still happen. The problem is we're more scared of it because it's more prevalent in the media, because scare sells, fear sells. And so you see all of these horror stories of people doing these terrible things, and it's front page of the news because it sells, and it's going to get more clicks, it's going to get more likes, it's going to get more engagement, it's going to make more money. So I think there's a better balance here. And this is an idea that I got from this book, and that is learning to resist interfering with your kids when they're playing with their siblings and peers. Because one of the things that he talks about is when parents are around, we can't help intervening in their play. And kids need some small degree of physical and emotional risk in order to learn and develop. And I largely agree with that. Minor bumps, scrapes, bruises, that's actually healthy for kids to have. It's a sign of an active child who is just playing and learning physical boundaries, emotional boundaries. And another issue too with what he is saying is it depends on the neighborhood that you live in. We live in a relatively safe neighborhood, so I am comfortable sending my 9 and my 12-year-old to various houses in the neighborhood. And as long as I know where they are, I'm okay with it. But not every neighborhood is like that. And so you have to be obviously aware of your own individual circumstances. So what are your guys' thoughts on just what you might call free range parenting?
Something he said in the book that I really liked was we want to see bruises, not scars. So it's not the idea of like going out and damaging your children or putting them out there to really hurt themselves. And I think that could be said both physically and with technology, right? So we obviously want to be careful with the opportunities we give them to learn. But as we believe, you got to give your kids opportunities to learn, right? So they are going to get bruises. They are going to get scratches. They're going to go and learn and explore, because how are they going to know if things are safe if they don't experience the unsafe, right? But that needs to be within boundaries. Don't let them just go out and do whatever to get those bruises and scrapes of what you're comfortable with. But taking that same thing within the technology world that we want to allow them to experience. We don't want to just put them in the technology world that they're going to have scars. We want to give them technology and have the boundaries that they're going to learn and grow from what we allow them to do.
Yeah. And, we live in a different world than the 70s and 80s, which is when I grew up. Well, maybe more of the 80s. But while it's probably not as dangerous, there are other circumstances and facts that are contributing to it as well that I think the book might miss a little bit here. And one of the struggles here is public perception as well. And so as parents, we need to be careful, because if our children are just free roaming, there's some public perception of things that could go on. And what I'm referring to is this fear that, oh, there's these kids that are, unwatched or uncared for because they're just running around the neighborhood and nobody knows where they belong or why they're doing what they're doing. But all in all, finding ways for kids to be outdoors, to be in social interactions face to face, get them off video games, get them off of anything with a screen, spending more time in a face-to-face setting with other peers does allow more for those opportunities to experience what life is. And I love what Selina said, the bruises, not scars, that the book mentions, because as hard as this is for parents, we spend so much time trying to protect our kids from physical and emotional harm, when in reality, they need to experience a little bit of pain and a little bit of hurt, because life is full of that. We're all going to experience it. We can't take it away. We try and take it away. And then when they become adults and they experience it in the real world, they don't know how to do it. And we end up with more depression and more mental health issues because they have no idea what to do. And we see the same thing medically as well. And I think the book mentions this too, but our immune system grows and is strengthened by getting sick and experiencing germs and bacteria. If we take all of that away, we have a weak immune system. And so I think our emotions are the same way. Our physical bodies are the same way. We have to experience the bumps and the bruises and the hurt and the pain. We have to experience what it means to be safe and not be safe. And sometimes we just got to let our kids fail a little bit, even when they're young. And that failing should be outside of social media. Social media is not a great way for them to fail. It's too powerful and the consequences are too high. And we see that in our work all the time. As we work with individuals, we see the effects of this. While the stats are astounding, when it gets to the one-on-one personal issues that we see, so often much of this can be traced back to social media, the usage of social media. And I don't know, we'll probably get into this later, but the volume of time, especially at night, oh man, that's the worst time to be on a screen for kids, especially, but for adults, just the same. It's harder to sleep. We don't get as much rest. I know he talks about adolescents needing, I don't remember what he said, but I think around 9 hours of sleep. Children, 9 hours, adolescents, 8, maybe is what he said. But that need for sleep for us to function is so critical. And again, here we set boundaries and limitations, right? We don't necessarily have to say, well, you can't have a phone because I'm afraid you're going to scroll on it all night. Well, phones can be turned in at night to mom and dad and placed in a safe place. So we can still have a phone. We can still have access. We can even have the smartphones that give us the capacity to do the things that we feel are important and of value for communication. We can't call the neighbor's home phone line anymore because nobody has a home phone anymore, and so that communication piece is important for parents. And there's some tracking that we can do that might be helpful in some situations. And all of those things can be utilized in a healthy and appropriate way and still have our children playing outside. And sometimes we'll even in our house have rules like, hey, no TV until after the sun goes down, or no, video games until after the sun. And we're pretty limited on video games anyway, on the time we allow video games. We're very, very limited on that. But that just encourages them to be outside and to be with friends and to do other things. And then, a short period of wind down and utilizing entertainment in those ways just kind of creates those healthy habits that allows their brains to properly develop and the proper experiences so that they can manage life and we don't end up with greater levels of depression or anxiety or whatever the struggle might be.
Right. And, I like this idea of balance. I mean, obviously, you're not just going to give your kid a knife so they learn how to safely use a knife. Like, you're not just going to say, oh, hey, 5-year-old, here's this knife, figure out how to use it. Okay, that's wildly insane and inappropriate. But, there's lots of other ways that you can help your children grow, learn, and develop important skills. So I think a really good place to start is to not interfere with their play. So I had a really good example of this a couple of weeks ago. We had a ton of kids at our house over the weekend, just a bunch of neighborhood kids that happened to be congregating at our house. And they're like these X-Shot things. It's one of those squirt guns where you pull the water into it and then you can squirt it. And, we filled up some buckets and we were just kind of letting them have at it in the back of the yard. And my only rule is don't squirt me. Aim away from the house because I didn't want to get wet, right? So again, see, boundaries matter. But what I found myself doing, what I kept doing is, because I'm back there with them, keeping an eye on things, I found myself saying, hey, don't do that, or don't do this, or stop that, or stop that. Try not to do that. And eventually I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to let them go. I'm just going to let them figure it out. Nobody is in immediate danger. Okay. I mean, nobody's going to get seriously hurt from what they are doing. Don't monitor their play. If there's fighting that happens, don't just immediately jump in and resolve it for them. Let them figure it out and wait for them to either come to you or until you're concerned about there obviously being an escalation of it resulting in physical blows or something crazy like that. But, let them just monitor and create their own play because it gives them that sense of independence. And one of the things that he said is that this helps them to learn negotiation skills. It helps them learn conflict resolution. And they also learn how to avoid getting hurt. They're going to learn that if I keep running full tilt at somebody and I run into them, it's going to hurt. They're going to learn natural consequences in a really healthy way.
Well, I might challenge you on a couple of things there.
Okay.
Especially if they come to you to resolve an issue. Helping them find the solution is as far as I might want to go, unless somebody's in serious risk. That's a different story.
Sure.
But
yeah,
they come, well, so-and-so is being mean and I tried to talk to him and I want you to come fix it for me, Mom. Another way to look at this is to say, oh man, that's rough. What do you think you're going to do about that? Mm-hmm. How do you think you're going to handle that? And see if there's an opportunity for them to find the solution and not only find it, but also to execute the solution on their own. And he talks a lot about this, getting rid of the parent or coach directed play in as many circumstances as possible. And you know what? I'm going to say something that's going to be pretty controversial, but for boys, if it comes to blows, it's okay. It's not terrible. Part of growing up and experiencing that helps us to learn that, hey, here's a way to handle things. Here's not a way to handle things. And this is the result. Now, I don't suggest you tell your kid to go get in a fist fight with somebody. And I suggest that we try and avoid that and teach that fighting isn't generally the answer. But there's a whole nother topic we can get into another day that isn't part of this book that is associated with that and what I see and what the research says on that topic. But I'll just leave it as sometimes that might not be the worst thing that happens, is to allow something to go a little bit further like that. Again, getting uninvolved and allowing the kids to experience the play and what you talked about, that negotiation piece and that compromise, and they will create their own sets of rules and understandings, conflict resolution between one another. They're all such powerful things that cannot happen in a virtual environment. And they do not happen well when parents direct or coach directs those interactions.
Yeah. And I also want to point out and recognize that there could be circumstances or family dynamics where this may not work. So maybe you have a special needs kid and there's an exception to almost every rule, right? And so, yeah, there may be reasons, or with your family dynamic, you maybe have a developmentally aggressive kid or something like that, and it's just not going to work. But in general, I agree with what Jeremiah is saying. Yeah, let them figure it out. And if it does happen to come to blows, that's a great learning opportunity, because you can only teach them, okay, because you can ask, what could you have done instead? That's a great learning opportunity. How could you have de-escalated the situation before it came to that? And it's also a great way to say and teach them that's not really an acceptable way to deal with our problems. We need to find better solutions. And so, as we've said, it's just a great teaching opportunity.
I appreciate that you put in there the disclaimer that there are exceptions, and especially when we have special needs or something of that nature. We also would never want to allow, if we've got huge age and size discrepancies.
Yes.
But again, that could be a topic for another day for us. We have to be reasonable. When we're talking about peers, we're talking about a lot of similarities where kids should be playing. We shouldn't have 8-year-olds playing with 14-year-olds anyway, in general,
Right.
where possible. But sometimes we'll end up in those situations where we'll have larger groups of people with varying ages, and we want to watch that a little bit.
Sure. Okay. So we are probably roughly a third of the way through the book at this point. So we will continue. We knew we weren't going to get through this whole book in one episode. So this will be a multi-part series, and we will pick it up again next week. So final thoughts on just kind of today's topic.
In the book, it also talked about how in a biosphere, they were controlling everything. And in a specific part about how the trees would just fall over. And so I like that analogy to use with our own children, to think and realize, or ourselves, that we need to have something pressuring up against us. We need to have those wins. We need to have adversity. We need to have things that don't go good for us so that we can learn how to stand strong and stand up against and have that. So if we don't have strong winds of things coming at us, things we don't like, adversity, then we're going to get weak and we're just going to fall. And I can see that with children and adults, even that's where anxiety is going to come in. You won't know how to handle things, or you won't be able to be strong and stand for the things you need to do in your life. So looking and recognizing, having those wins that are coming at us helps us to grow and be a strong tree.
And as parents, we tend to want to remove adversity from our children's lives. We want to make it as easy and gentle as possible. And it is such a terrible idea. That adversity is so critical, like Selina was talking about, to their growth and their development, their capacity to manage life and to manage emotions and the hard things that are going to come. But what we don't want to do, and it's interesting, as parents, we want to take it all away, and then we give them a cell phone and social media and internet access. And what we did is just opened up the floodgates of adversity at levels they're not capable of managing. So like this biosphere that Selina talked about that they created in the desert, these trees would just fall over. Well, if you have a young tree that has massive, massive winds, hurricane force winds, it's just going to blow over too. That kind of adversity doesn't help it. It destroys it. And that's what we're doing to our kids. We're opening the floodgates of adversity that will destroy them rather than letting them experience and accept the adversity that comes naturally through play that doesn't include electronic devices.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to take a quote directly from the book, and that is, experience, not information, is the key to emotional development. You can talk about emotions all day long, but unless they actually experience those emotions and feel, they're never going to know. And it's the same thing with any type of development. A kid is never going to understand how to be safe or what safety is if they don't get out and learn how to be safe, if they don't experience pain, right? And, that doesn't mean dropping your kid off of a cliff so they can experience pain. It means letting them fall and scrape their knee, or letting them ride a bike and fall and scrape their knee that way, or letting them roughhouse and get hurt roughhousing and experiencing those things. So it's all important for just healthy, normal, good development. So next week, we're going to continue with the introduction of the phone-based childhood is what we're going to continue. So tune in for that next week, and we will see you all then. Have a question? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com.